Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme today we'll be discussing the dangerous escalation that we potentially could see in the war in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia, now that a spokesman of President Putin has threatened Britain that we could face a nuclear holocaust by Christmas in response to the United States and Britain supplying Ukrainian with long-range tactical missiles to go deep into Russian territory. And we'd be asking, are we on the brink of World War III, and is a nuclear exchange just around the corner? Reagan, it's great to join you on Behind Headlines. Of course, I don't want to spread any kind of fear-mongering regarding this programme, but the actual prospects that we face, particularly with President Putin in Russia and this ongoing conflict in Ukraine, particularly as we've passed the 1,000 days of this conflict, is the prospect that during any time in the past, during the Cold War, we have never been at a time where we could be so close to a nuclear conflict between Russia and the West. And it's only by the grace of God that I think we'll see intervention on that level. But it's not to alarm our viewers, but to know that the world situation is becoming increasingly precarious.
The scriptures are very clear, even in warning of wars and rumors of wars. There's even in the prophets, there's depictions that look very similar to nuclear holocaust and the consequences of nuclear fallout. And we have to understand that this is the world in which we live. We recognize and understand that we are living in very dark times, very dark days. Whether this is that moment where we will see some form of a nuclear holocaust, so to speak, occur or not, there is that reality that there is coming rampant and horrific destruction, and it will only continue to increase, as will lawlessness prior to the return of the Lord as He continues to work out His perfect plan and purpose for all of humanity. But the reason that it's so important we have this discussion, and the reason that we're presenting it to our viewers, is that it has been reported in the past week by the Daily Mail that President Putin's former spokesman and very close friend, Sergey Markov, has made a chilling threat to Britain and the West that we could be heading towards nuclear war by Christmas. And this threat has come after the US, Britain, and France agreed to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles to strike deep into Russian territory. Russia last week, for the first time, fired an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, into Ukraine for the first time, according to news report. Now, while it's designed to be intercontinental and it's designed to carry a nuclear warhead, this of course, was not the case. It was not carrying a nuclear warhead. However, it does seem that this was a test. This was like a warning shot and an indicator. We have these ICBMs and we are willing to use them.
And of course, Russia and China and North Korea have the supersonic missiles as well. And the fact that the North Koreans and the Russians and the Iranians are getting so much closer, we could, and the Chinese as well, we could see moves towards World War III, and this is why the situation in Ukraine is so critical. We saw, for example, that the prospect of nuclear war could be on the horizon if just weeks before Donald Trump is inaugurated as America's next president. And of course, he has a totally different policy on the Ukraine, which is playing into this. And I think the reason why people are hopeful that Donald Trump can bring peace to this situation is because I don't think for one moment that Donald Trump is interested in regime change, in removing President Putin from power, which seems to be the main game and objective of the Democrats, and trying to drag Russia into this conflict, to drain Russia's military resources to hopefully then bring about a coup. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that Putin is an extremely dangerous totalitarian dictator. And if you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. And if the West hadn't put up a strong defense in front of for the Ukraine, then it seems clear that he would have then invaded the Baltic states and other European countries to reconquer those European nations to be under the influence of Russia like they were in the Soviet Union.
We've now had 1,000 days of war in Ukraine following Vladimir Putin's onslaught. You and I, Simon, talked for a full year before that of how this conflict was imminent. I cannot forget how only weeks before that invasion, I was being borderline ridiculed at a dinner party by some individuals who said this would never happen. It's never going to happen. It's impossible. It's just fear-mongering. It's stoking up. We hope that this escalation that we're talking about does not happen, and yet it very well could. We pray against it. Yet this is the reality of where we're at. And what I find interesting and very concerning is this is a massive change in Biden's policy, even a massive change in the plan only just before Trump becomes the U.S. president.
So there's two reasons for this. U.S. national security advisors are saying this is because of the deployment of over 11,000 North Korean troops to fight alongside Russian forces.
And that's happening in Kursk.
Which is very important. And now the news reports coming out that North Korea could supply an extra 100,000 North Korean troops to the Kursk area, because this is the one territory that the Ukrainians want to hang on to in the hope that they will be able to negotiate a peaceful settlement between Ukraine and Putin when finally this war comes to an end.
Russia is needing all of the help it can get because there's routine reports, Simon, of psychotic-like behavior. There was just in the Daily Mail recently another report talking about Russian troops running into Ukrainian fire like psychos. It's basically just some sort of meat grinder machine of war that's happening, and they're experiencing catastrophic loss of life. I am still very much of the opinion that many of these Russian soldiers truly do not want to be there. They do not believe in this cause and feel that it is better to die and to expose themselves to almost certain death against the Ukrainians than perpetrate an ongoing conflict that's unjust.
And it's obviously proving the advantage the Ukrainians have in kind of Western military technology that they're deploying against Russia and Russia's forces. Now that the British Foreign Office have reduced a paper, and this is an extract from a speech. So this would say that Ukraine remains resilient 1,000 days after Russia's illegal war of aggression. UK statement to the OSCE, that stands for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And this speech was made on the 20th of November 2024. It says this one. UK military advisor Nicholas Olcott says that Russia's war of aggression has been a strategic miscalculation that is exacting a heavy toll on Russia's military and economy. He went on to say that although Russia is expected to achieve victory within a matter of days, the people of the Ukraine have remained resilient and brave in defense of their homeland. They have presented a series of challenges to the Russian military, extracting a significant price, with credible reports suggesting that Russia has incurred up to 700,000 casualties, killed or wounded. It could even be more.
Last weekend, Russia attempted to double down on its aggressive actions, conducting one of the largest missile strikes against Ukraine in the last year. A complex coordinated attack targeting energy infrastructure across Ukraine in the early hours of the 17th of November. The strikes reportedly consisted of 120 missiles launched from air, land, and maritime platforms and 90 one-way attack UAVs against Ukraine's largest thermal power plants and transformer substations. Now, as has repeatedly been the case in this war, it is the Ukrainian civilian population who suffer as a consequence of Putin's illegal actions. And the large-scale strikes killed at least 10 civilians and many more were injured, with Ukraine's energy grid also suffering severe damage, with several regions experiencing power outages. Now, remember that Ukraine is not quite as temperate a climate as our own. How would we struggle with just 0 Celsius?
Minus 20 they're talking about.
Minus 20.
I mean, it shows you how cruel this war is, because it shows that the Russians are not interested in targeting pretty much military targets in Ukraine, but are actually targeting civilian targets. And the fact is, if they destroy Ukraine's energy reserves and energy plants, that means that it plunges not only the whole nation into darkness, but freezing darkness with temperatures minus 20. Which is a kind of very, very cruel way and evil way to fight a war.
Ukraine has now incurred more than 30,000 civilian casualties, 10,000 killed, 20,000 injured, and it's the largest displacement crisis since World War II. 13 million people displaced. That's nearly a third of Ukraine's pre-war population. The destruction of civil infrastructure has been catastrophic, and appalling human rights abuses, including forced deportation of over 19,500 Ukrainian children. And moreover, the war will have long-lasting psychological impact on the Ukrainian people. It already is having that sort of impact. We're talking extreme mental health crisis, PTSD, and the sort. While the cost to Russia is indicative of serious strategic miscalculation, with President Putin continuing to callously throw Russian lives at the front despite suffering an average of, get this, 1,350 casualties a day. Absolutely catastrophic. No,
I mean, this is kind of worse than America's war against the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, or this is actually worse than Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And Putin is paying a high price in terms of his own military, who are being sacrificed on a daily basis.
Well, and viewers need to also remember, because I know that there's still, I think it's beginning to fade. I hope it's beginning to fade, but I know that there are still contingents of Putin sympathizers that are out there, despite the ongoing horrors that we've seen. I believe there still is a small fraction of individuals who are out there who sympathize with Russia and uphold it as a paragon of some form of fading virtue. But Russia is walking hand in hand with North Korea here, where it is North Korea, reminder, is the most dangerous place to openly be a Christian. Okay, in fact, openly be anything other than a worshiper of its regime and its dictatorship. Russian citizens are the only individuals, even over Chinese, who are able to enter North Korea at the moment. Its borders have remained closed to everyone except Russians post-COVID.
And if you remember at the first stages of the war, it seems like special forces, Western special forces, I believe, actually took out Chechen forces that were on their way to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And had they succeeded, they would have been absolutely ruthless. So this is really the first time that we see that Russia is now deploying over 10,000 of a foreign army, namely North Koreans, with the prospect of possibly another 100,000 joining as well. That does change the dynamics of this war as well, because clearly Putin does not want to lose face. If he can come to some agreement where he stays in control of the Donbas region or has control over the Crimea, then he can present this as a great sacrifice of the Russian people and the soldiers in this war for greater Russia, and he then has a legacy. But despite the fact that he has now presided over absolute misery and carnage, not only in the Ukraine, but also in Russia as well. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN News report now that reports on the 1,000 days of war since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and how that US President Joe Biden has given the green light for the Ukrainians to use long-range missiles to fire deep into Russian territory. Is certainly a game changer, and is also then provoking a massive Russian reaction in return.
In a makeshift maternity ward in the basement of this hospital in the Kherson region, Rosa Antonova cradles her newborn baby Amelia tightly.
All the plans we had before the war, we decided that there's probably no time to postpone anything for later. We had to live for now. Despite the fact that the war continues, and despite the consequences in the city and in Ukraine in general, we try to hold on.
For her and for people across Ukraine, today's milestone is another sad reminder of how 1,000 days of fighting have led to immense human suffering, with millions of lives disrupted, cities in ruins, and the toll of military casualties growing daily.
Every day we live in Ukraine is a miracle.
In Kyiv, a memorial has sprung up in the heart of the city, dotted with Ukrainian flags, each honoring a soldier who died fighting Russia. Svetlana Kirichenko came to place a flag to remember her fallen son.
I put the flag so that someone would pass by and see that this person lived once, gave his life for all of us.
Despite heavy losses, Ukraine has continued to fight in the face of escalating Russian attacks. With 2 months left in office, the Biden administration is now helping Ukrainians take their fight directly to the Russians. The White House has allowed Ukraine to use American-supplied long-range Army tactical missile systems.
This would be the first time they've been used to target inside Russia, and significantly inside Russia.
The missiles will be deployed in the Kursk region, where Ukrainian troops are facing Russian and North Korean forces.
It's limited to Kursk, and it's limited, of course, to the amount of missiles that we can get to Ukraine in the near future. So it is a substantial step, but it might not change the battlefield that much.
The Kremlin is warning that deploying long-range missiles is only adding fuel to the fire. Russia's president updated his country's nuclear doctrine today, saying that he has the right to use nuclear weapons if attacked with conventional missiles by a country backed by a nuclear-armed nation. George Thomas, CBN News.
Always thankful to CBN, and particularly George Thomas. I've been very impressed over the duration of this war with George's on-the-ground reporting in so many ways. Very, very helpful, and always much gratitude from us at Revelation TV. Now, this relates very heavily to us, Simon, because Putin's former spokesperson is actually making a threat of the possibility of nuclear war targeting British soil before Christmas.
I mean, that's quite a frightening scenario. I mean, we have seen the fact that Putin has threatened nuclear weapons, but the fact that this is a specific threat, it's also in response to the long-range missiles that Britain, under Keir Starmer's, given Ukraine the green light to go ahead and fire deep into Russian territory, does mean that we are effectively now at war with Russia. So this is no longer a war between the Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between Britain, France, and also the United States, which could then potentially lead into a global war, because we know that it's the aim to push Putin and Russia back.
Well, this pro-Putin mouthpiece, essentially, Sergey Markov, has said that this move by U.S. President Joe Biden to allow long-range missiles to be fired deep into Russian territory could mean Britons are unable to wish each other happy Christmas as they could be in shelters. Now, I don't know exactly where our shelters are these days.
I don't think we have any since the Cold War.
Yeah.
So, so maybe the Russians do and we don't. I mean, they're very famous being built in the 1950s when we faced the threat of nuclear war. And, there was often, nuclear bunkers built for key government personnel, military personnel. But these days, I think you can probably buy an old Cold War bunker quite cheaply. Maybe we have to start reinvesting in nuclear bunkers. I pray that we don't, but that could be the scenario that we face. Now, the Daily Mail reported back on Tuesday, the 19th of November, under the heading, "Saber Rattling Putin's Mouthpiece warns Brits of a nuclear war before Christmas after Biden gave Ukraine the green light to use long-range US rockets to strike deep into Russia. And it says here that a pro-Putin mouthpiece has warned Britain of a nuclear war by Christmas after Ukraine was granted permission to fire Western long-range missiles into Kremlin territory. Sergey Markov, a former spokesman for President Putin, said today that Western allies, including Britain, France and US, have taken a big jump towards nuclear conflict by giving Ukraine such an approval. Markov, a regular Putin mouthpiece, said the shock move by the US President Joe Biden could mean that Britons were unable to wish each other Happy Christmas as they could be in their shelters.
Now, on BBC Radio 4, Markov, currently the Director General of Russia's Institute for Political Studies, was asked his reaction to the White House's decision, and he said, "My reaction was awful. I couldn't sleep well because I'm just afraid nuclear war is coming. The decision of the United States, Great Britain and France is not a step towards nuclear war. It is a big jump toward nuclear war, nuclear catastrophe. It is a very dangerous decision. The point is these rocket missiles cannot be fired by the Ukrainian army technically, because these rocket missiles need to have a very good map of the Russian territory, and only the US has this map. Even Great Britain and France does not have this map. The second reason is the targeting of the rocket missiles. It cannot be done by the Ukrainian army because it needs satellite intelligence, which Ukraine does not have. So it means these rocket missiles will be targeted to Russian cities by American, British, and French militaries. So we regard this as the start of a direct war by Britain, America, and France against Russia, another nuclear power. American rocket missiles against our territory, this is a clear escalation of the war. But at the same time, Simon, there's only one side here that's actually threatening nuclear attacks, and that's Russia.
Yeah.
We don't have Ukraine threatening nuclear war. We don't have America, Great Britain, or France threatening nuclear war. Russia is the only one actually looking at something that would have catastrophic implications for the world.
And this is the danger, I think, with Putin. If he thinks he's in a losing position, whereby he feels like not only would he lose the war in Ukraine, but also lose his presidency, then he could press the red button. As a sense that if you're going to bring me down, I'll bring you down with me. That's the danger, I think, of Putin, and that's why we shouldn't underestimate him. The article went on to say in the Daily Mail, the actual spokesman on behalf of President Putin and a close ally says, we will have American, British and French rocket missiles which will kill our people in our internationally recognized territory. He said, this is a war that you started. I think it's extremely dangerous. Asked if Putin would use nuclear missiles in response, Mr. Markov said, not now, and said it was more likely that bases in Eastern Europe could be hit by smaller tactical nuclear missiles. He added, I think Biden and Macron and Starmer want escalation, which could lead, from my understanding, in the worst scenario, the nuclear war happens before Christmas this year. He says, probably you will not be able to say Merry Christmas because you all stay in your hole trying to hide away with your family from a nuclear catastrophe. It can develop very, very quickly. This escalation can lead to escalation by the Russian side. And the Kremlin has accused of Biden of throwing fuel on the flames of the Ukraine conflict by allowing Kiev to fire long-range tactical missiles. And this is the very situation that we face, is that we now openly have those threats. And even Putin has made similar threats himself.
And for 2 years, we see that President Biden has ignored the pleas of Vladimir Zelensky to let him use Western missiles to strike key Russian installations across the border. On each occasion, the White House has insisted such a move would be escalatory, leaving the Ukrainian president in a borderline state of despair. Just 2 months before President Biden is to leave office, however, there's been a massive change of strategy, and he's finally been convinced that he should approve Ukraine's request. Senior U.S. security officials confirmed that the determining factor has been Russia's recruitment of 10,000 North Korean troops to bolster its ranks, with these soldiers expected to lead a counteroffensive intended to recapture Ukrainian-held territory in southern Russia. Holding onto ground in southern Russia province of Kursk remains a strategic imperative for Ukraine ahead of peace talks expected next year. Without this territory, Ukraine has no leverage to recover its eastern provinces, which are currently occupied by Russian troops. Putin is believed to have fired that new ICBM that we were talking, the intercontinental ballistic missile designed to carry nuclear warheads, already into Ukraine.
The big question is, do you think that President Biden would have given the green light for these long-range tactical missiles to be fired deep into Russian territory during the election? So the answer, during the US presidential election, with the prospect of Kamala Harris becoming president, no. Would he have made this decision if Kamala Harris had become president? I don't think he would have done. I think it's also the fact that he wants to carry out his objective, or the Biden administration's objective, to try and attempt as much regime change, or bring about regime change as they can against Putin, at the same time of essentially making it very difficult for President-elect Trump to become America's next president, and it's very, very precarious. So surely at this period of transition, you don't want to poke the Russian bear, which is exactly what Biden has done. Now let's go to this news report. It's a couple of years old, but really does explain the dangers of nuclear war and the prospect that if this situation gets out of the hand, this is what we could be facing.
This is a simulation of a full-scale nuclear war between Russia and NATO. Casualties mount at a rate of 10 million people per hour.
4 hours. 5 hours.
A Princeton University simulation estimated more than 90 million immediate casualties. Some studies have placed total casualties in the hundreds of millions. Then there would be a nuclear winter for weeks or months or even years, when clouds of soot block sunlight, creating sub-freezing temperatures which, along with high radiation levels, would lead to even more deaths. What was once unthinkable is now regularly debated on Russian state TV, using nuclear weapons against Ukraine, NATO, or even against U.S. territory. This Russian parliament member says it would only take 4 nuclear missiles to destroy both coasts of the United States. This journalist says if Russia loses in Ukraine, a nuclear strike seems probable. But is this just theater intended to scare the West? Would Vladimir Putin actually resort to nuclear weapons? Experts disagree. But what is disturbing is that some think he would. Rebecca Koffler, born in the Soviet Union and a former intelligence official for the U.S. government, is the author of Putin's Playbook. She says Vladimir Putin would absolutely use a nuclear weapon.
This type of conflict is exactly the type of situation for which Putin, on his orders, the so-called nuclear warfare doctrine was developed that was called escalate to de-escalate. You're escalating by popping a nuke in a conventional conflict, in this case of Ukraine, in order to de-escalate the conflict. And if Russian intelligence services assess accurately or by mistake that the US and NATO are about to intervene, Putin preemptively would activate that doctrine.
Koffler says Putin believes he has the upper hand because of his large arsenal of small tactical nuclear weapons, intended to destroy battlefield targets rather than whole regions.
Russia holds advantage in tactical nukes, 1 to 10 ratio. We have 200, the Russians have 2,000.
Some have speculated that if Putin orders a nuclear strike, his staff might disobey the order, triggering a coup. Koffler says that won't happen.
This is such a Western and American style thinking. Nobody is going to refuse Putin's orders. We're talking about the person who has authorized multiple assassinations.
While some experts say that Putin would never risk a nuclear war that could also destroy Russia, others warn that with Vladimir Putin, nothing can be ruled out. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
And this week's special guest joining us on Behind the Headlines is Rhett Parkinson, the director of the Armed Forces Christian Union. Rhett, it's always a pleasure to have you on Behind the Headlines, and we really appreciate your contribution and also the excellent work that you are doing ministering to Christians serving in our armed forces today. But share with us your thoughts on where we are in terms of the Ukraine war and how this past week has marked the 1,000 days since President Putin invaded the Ukraine back in February of 2022.
Well, I think war is always tragic, and 1,000 days of war has to be a tragic milestone that we've passed. I think that there's a lot of loss of life, and it's difficult to understand what the purposes are of that conflict. War is politics by other means, as someone was once quoted, and I think it's a failure of diplomacy and politics. So tragic milestone to pass.
What's your military perspective on how the war in Ukraine has changed since U.S. President Biden and Keir Starmer have given the Ukrainians a green light to launch the Storm Shadow missiles deep into Russian territory?
Well, I think that decision had been telegraphed for quite a few months, and so I would imagine the Russians took the requisite actions to move their critical assets away from the front line. And so whilst it is another string to the bow for the Ukrainians in terms of options for prosecuting targets in depth, I think there are, most military commentators would agree that fundamentally it won't change the nature of the conflict itself. What it will do is bring it home potentially to more Russians further behind the front lines, further into Russia. And I think for Putin, who likes to portray himself as a strong man who's fighting for the interests of the Russian people, that must be uncomfortable. And perhaps that is why we're hearing from the Russian politicians more bellicose sort of words and threats about the possibility of a nuclear conflict. However, I think that's unlikely, but I don't think bringing these additional weapons onto the battlefield fundamentally changes the overall state of where we're at in this just over 1,000 day of conflict between the two nations.
And Rhett, what do you make of the US Biden's national security spokesman, who's come out and said the reason why they are giving the Ukrainians the green light to launch long-range missiles deep into Russian territory is because of the fact that the Russians have deployed over 11,000 North Korean soldiers, with the prospect that over 100,000 may be joining in the war against the Ukraine. Share with us how this situation is desperately and dangerously escalating.
Well, I think we've seen that over time, that each time another change has come to the battlefield, another weapon system given to the Ukrainians, the Russians have said, well, you're escalating the conflict. I guess the boot is on the other foot this time, in that it's the Russians who have invited and enabled these North Korean soldiers to come and join in, even if they don't join in directly, the assault waves, the meat grinder as it's called, of soldiers attacking Ukrainians in the frontline positions, even if they just release Russian sort of logistics troops and other rare area troops. Is going to enable more Russian troops to assault. So I think it is a concern that is being seen certainly and portrayed in terms of justifying the change in policy for the US and other allies, including Britain and France, to change their restrictions on the weapons that they have given. And I think that is a concern, that we are ratcheting up in terms of escalation the conflict that's going on the eastern side of Europe, on that front line of Ukraine and Russia.
Give us your opinion on what Sergey Markov, seen as a spokesman for President Putin, has said in the past week. I think Biden, Macron and Starmer want escalation, which could lead to, from my understanding, in the worst scenario, the nuclear war happens before Christmas of this year. Probably you will not be able to say Merry Christmas because you will stay in the hole trying to hide away your family from the nuclear catastrophe. It can develop very, very quickly.
Well, I think nuclear war has always been a concern ever since probably the first atomic bombs were dropped in 1945, and certainly reached a crescendo in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. What that brought in, of course, was a much better communications between the Warsaw Pact, the Russians primarily, and NATO and the Americans. And what we don't seem to have is the same kind of level of mechanisms that are in place. So I think that is of concern. I think to offset that, the Russians are clearly, I mean, they've said quite a few times they've had all sorts of red lines, whether that's deploying F-16 fighters or tanks onto the battlefield in support of Ukraine and various other things. So this feels like another red line that the Russians are putting in. This is the kind of ultimate red line. I think it is part of their bellicose attitude to try and create the fear and the uncertainty amongst the Western powers that this is a concern. But I have to be honest, I think we're in the final days of this conflict. I think Trump being elected to the White House, whether he could bring a close, I don't think anybody seriously believes he can bring a close to the war in a day. But I think his direction of travel is quite clear, and therefore I think often, to quote again a well-used phrase, the darkest hour is the hour before dawn, and we can hope and pray that this is the hour before dawn, so that the Russians and Ukrainians are making their final sort of positions, fighting as hard as they can to win the best possible positions to negotiate a peace, and that I think is likely to happen in 2025, partly because the two sides have worn themselves down and they're paying a terrible cost, but also I think Trump has indicated that he's not willing to let the status quo continue into the future. So we are going to see a change of some description, a significant change, I think, in the next year.
And Rhett, we certainly pray that that is a case, that Donald Trump and the new administration can bring peace between Ukraine and Russia. But having said that, surely we're at a stage now where a nuclear conflict between Russia and the West is maybe inevitable, or a very likely scenario, certainly more likely than any other time during the Cold War, which was governed by the mutually assured destruction. Do you think that MAD will play a huge part in the calculation and the thinking of President Putin, or do you think he could actually fire a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine or against other Eastern European nations?
Well, Simon, who knows what goes through President Putin's mind? I think if he were a rational state actor president, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. That said, I think he recognizes, and I would be very surprised if President Biden or one of his senior statesmen hasn't had a very firm word with Putin to say, if he even reaches for the tactical nuclear button, as it were, to that option, then there would be very severe consequences for the country and for him personally. And we can only hope and pray that that communication is clear. And that despite all previous decisions that Putin has made, that this one is a rational decision, and that he doesn't pursue that option because the consequences are completely unknown. We've not been here before, in a sense, and therefore, whilst a possibility, one can only pray that there is a sense, there's a sensible approach to it and a rational approach.
And finally, Rhett, how can we be praying for and standing with Christians serving in our armed forces today? And how can we support the excellent work that you are doing with the Armed Forces Christian Union?
Thank you, Reagan. Well, a lot of our soldiers and sailors, including submariners in the permanent nuclear deterrent, who deploy for 4 to 6 months at a time with no comms back home, and our aviators are already deployed, not just across Eastern Europe, but all around the world, doing what His Majesty government requires of them to do. Many of them will be away over Christmas. We send care packages out to our soldiers and also to the families back home to remind them physically that we are thinking of them and praying for them. I think if your viewers are interested in praying for and being better informed as to how to pray for Christians in the armed forces, then the best thing is to go to our website, just Google Armed Forces Christian Union, and you'll find us. And we very much appreciate your support, and we know that prayer is the ultimate spiritual weapon that we can deploy in any situation. So I'd encourage them to pray, and particularly this Christmas, perhaps more than most, to pray for the peace that surpasses all understanding and the cessation of conflicts around the world, particularly in Ukraine and Russia.
Amen. Rhett Parkinson, we just thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines. Always a pleasure, and we all appreciate the great work that you are doing with the Armed Forces Christian Union. And please do send our love to Christian men and women who are serving in our armed forces today, on the front lines in protecting our freedom and keeping us safe from aggressors like President Putin.
Thank you, Simon and Reagan, and for all the team at Revelation TV. God bless you.
The Daily Telegraph reported back on the 23rd of November, under the heading "Putin's new hypersonic missile is a warning to Britain. This footage shows why." That the Russian president says weapon which has struck Ukraine is designed for a decisive strike on Britain. The Kremlin's latest hypersonic intermediate range ballistic missile is actually one of its most dangerous. Putin test-fired the Oreshnik, the Russian word for hazelnut tree, for the first time in combat on Thursday against the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. He later boasted that it had been designed for a decisive strike on Britain and added a chilling warning. "I recommend that the ruling elites of those countries that are hatching plans to use their military contingents against Russia seriously think about this," Putin said. Now, so secret was the development of the Oreshnik that very little is known about it until footage emerged of its first strike, with experts describing it as an experimental hybrid missile that sits in a category between intercontinental and intermediate range missiles. This means it has a range of around 3,000 miles, easily enough to strike Britain. Analyzing the video, Andrei Baklitsky, a senior researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction program for the United Nations, said that the video showed multiple warheads crashing into Dnipro at high speed. They all fell in a close vicinity of each other, more consistent with MRV technology, meaning the warheads were not independently targeted, he said.
And he also said there, we got another quote here from Michael Bonhurt, an engineer with the US think tank, the RAND Corporation, described it as part of Russia's strategic nuclear triad, a change from missiles that Kremlin has been firing at the Ukraine throughout the war. Says what is different is missiles that tend to be intermediate range missiles, and almost every intercontinental ballistic missile is nuclear capable, he said. So clearly what we're seeing here is that President Putin is sending a message to the West that if you continue to escalate, if you continue to arm the Ukrainians with long-range missiles capable of hitting targets deep into Russia, then we have the potential to fire a nuclear missile at you. And clearly that is the message that President Putin is sending Britain, France and the United States at this dangerous time. And the reason why we're in a dangerous time is because of this interim period coming to the end of the Biden administration and then preparing for the transition of the Trump administration that will take power in January of next year with very different policies towards Russia and Ukraine.
Well, it's important to kind of look at that element of things as well, Simon, and is a response from Trump's allies, the U.S. supplying the Ukraine with long-range missile response, that is. Fox News reports that Trump allies warned Biden risking World War III by authorizing long-range missiles for Ukraine. Ukraine can now target positions in the Kursk region where Russia has fired up 50,000 troops. President Biden, for the first time, authorized Ukraine to use U.S.-given long-range missiles to strike inside Russia, a prospect that President-elect Trump's allies believe could threaten World War III. And this has been an ongoing concern that's been pushed forward. Now, the issue with this, Simon, is the Daily Mail spoke of this former spokesperson as engaging in saber rattling, and he, although a former spokesman, is a friend of President Putin's. Could some of this be making threats and basically bluffing in one way? Would Putin really desire to go to this length? Also, does this mean that the US and the UK should back down? Because this in some way also empowers Putin. He then is like, okay, I can do whatever I want.
Well, from a military perspective, and you have to take into account the military perspective in this one, as well as the political perspective as well. So the political perspective is, particularly with the transition in the United States between the Biden and Trump administration, is why escalate now with this period of uncertainty as there is that changeover of power between the Democrats and the Republicans? Why escalate it now, knowing the political situation could be very difficult? However, you speak to military generals on the ground, they would say that for order for the Ukraine to win this war, they need to be able to penetrate deep into Russian territory. They need to take this war from the Ukraine into Russia. But the only danger with all of this is that Russia is a nuclear power. A megalomaniac in President Putin is in power. He's unpredictable. No one knows what he's going to do. And if he thinks he's going to lose, there is that dangerous chance that he could fire a tactical nuclear weapon. Now, if he does fire that in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe, then the response of the West will be massive, and before we know it, we're engaged in a nuclear conflict. And where the rules of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, won't apply, which was the doctrine in the Cold War that kept the United States and the Soviet Union apart from actually pressing those red buttons that would launch a nuclear war.
Trump's incoming national security advisor, Representative Michael Waltz, who's a Republican in Florida, it says this is another step up the escalation ladder, and no one knows where this is going. And so in many ways, this is like a game of cards where each individual is having to make particularly strategic decisions based on what they assume is in the other's hand.
Maybe a Russian roulette is probably more appropriate.
I think that is more accurate, actually. And no one anticipated that Biden would escalate the war in Ukraine during the transition period. This is as if he is launching a whole new war. Rick Grinnell, Trump's former acting director of national intelligence wrote on social media platform X. Donald Trump Jr., the president-elect's son, wrote on X, "Everything has changed now. All previous calculations are null and void, and all for politics. The military-industrial complex seems to want to make sure they get World War III going before my father has a chance to create peace and save lives." On his way out of office, Biden is trying to start World War III by authorizing Ukraine the use of U.S. long-range missiles into Ukraine, according to Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican in Georgia, on, again, social media platform X. The American people gave a mandate on November 5th against these exact America Last decisions. And the Deputy National Security Advisor, Joe Feiner, in Rio de Janeiro on Monday did not comment specifically on long-range missiles, but suggested the introduction of North Korean forces factored into the White House's decision. The Biden administration not taking this decision during the U.S. presidential election. The question needs to be asked, would they have done this had Kamala Harris won the presidency? It's not so certain.
It seems very clear, though, that the military objective on behalf of the Biden administration is to ensure that the Ukraine maintain control of the Kursk region of Russia, so that if there is a peaceful settlement, that can be the bargaining chip for Russia to release its control of the Donbas region or Crimea, where this battle is at the most. And I think if you ask Putin what he'd want most, it would be the Crimea, that access to the Black Sea and the Black Sea Fleet. That would be what he'd probably want, but he'd also want to come out with a victory. Otherwise, I think, there's no chance. I don't think the Ukrainians can hold on to the area of Kursk. But with the American, British and French help, that's clearly what they want to do. Another worrying aspect in this war was a news story covered in the Daily Mail, and this is very chilling. The Daily Mail reported back on Monday, the 18th of November, that Sweden is preparing for nuclear war. Sweden is sending out 5 million pamphlets to residents, urging them to prepare for the possibility of war, with the instructions on how to stockpile food and even seek shelter during a nuclear attack, as fears grow of a conflict between Russia and NATO. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Stockholm has repeatedly urged Swedes to prepare both mentally and logistically for a possible conflict, citing the worst security situation in its vicinity. They produced a booklet that says, "If crisis or war comes," that was sent out by the Swedish Civil Constituencies Agency. It talks about how it contains information about how to prepare for emergencies such as war, natural disasters, cyber attacks and terrorism. And finally, an insecure world requires preparedness. The military threat to Sweden has increased and we must prepare for the worst armed attack. Its new instruction states. I mean, considering that Sweden has always been modelled as a kind of very peaceful country, very active in supplying troops to be peacekeepers around the world. The fact that they are now fearing, a Russian attack or a nuclear attack, and how the government in Sweden is actually preparing for this, is a kind of indication of where things are heading, and an escalation in this conflict that has the possibility of leading to a nuclear conflict, something that we need to pray against, but something that we should be aware could happen if the whole situation de-escalates or escalates to the extent that, as we saw in that previous video, de-escalates. But I don't think Putin, if he fires a nuclear weapon, even a tactical nuclear weapon, will de-escalate this situation. It will escalate.
Well, there are, absolutely, Simon, and there are elements in Bible prophecy that seem to, when we read them, they look very much like what one would see following a nuclear holocaust as such. And viewers, you may be anxious, you may be on edge, you may have a very real degree of fear. And I want us to remind ourselves that we who are God's people in Jesus Christ are not called to a spirit of fear. Okay, yes, there are things that are frightening out there. Is this frightening? Absolutely, it's frightening, but we are not called to a spirit of fear. We're not called to be crippled by or unduly influenced by fear. I really like these words, Simon, by C.S. Lewis, because atomic warfare and the threat of it has been on our doorstep previously, and he specifically dealt with atomic warfare and how we should respond. I'll just read a brief bit of it, and you can look it up. He said, the first point to be made and the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friends over a pint and a game of darts, not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies, a microbe can do that, but they need not dominate our minds.
And of course that was probably written in the 1950s or the early 60s, where the prospect of nuclear war was very real. Of course we had the Cuban Missile Crisis of 62, where we came to the brink of a nuclear conflict as the Russians were trying to supply Cuba with long-range missiles capable of hitting the United States. Of course, we came close during the Yom Kippur War of 1973 as well. And with the war in Ukraine, that situation is escalating still. This is why we need calm heads to prevail. And we need statesmen of the likes of JFK to diffuse this situation. And maybe it can't come, a Trump administration can't come soon enough. And I do think the key to this one, and this is what could bring about the big change, is the fact that Donald Trump does not want regime change in Russia, which will give President Putin a bit of breathing space. But you mentioned the Bible prophecy scriptures. There's quite a few. I mean, Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about the Gog and Magog war and how the bones were contaminated, and how they had to put yellow markers next to the bones. You read Revelation 8 and 9, that is an incredible description of what a Holocaust is, with a third of the earth being destroyed, the water turning toxic, every living creature dying, also the sun would no longer shine because everything would be in darkness, and that is a coming of the dreadful day of the Lord. Now, one thing I think we need to draw on the fact is that history is his story. Yes. God is sovereign. Yeah. Man is not sovereign. Putin is not sovereign. Starmer is not sovereign, nor is Joe Biden. Right. But God is. And he will only allow what he wants to allow for his purposes. Yes. And if we face a nuclear exchange, then you have to say that this is God's will, however horrific that will be. I don't think so, because I think God's hand of protection will be on that situation. But it just shows you man needs to place its faith, not in its politicians, but in Jesus Christ, who is the ark during these dark and dangerous times.
The scriptures say that the heavens will pass away, the earth will pass away with a roar, and everything will be burned up. There's potentially a picture there of some sort of nuclear disaster as well. We do know that we are coming to a day of destruction. We do know that we're coming to the day of judgment of the Lord, but remind yourselves of that hope that's ours in Jesus Christ, that there will be resurrection and we will inherit a new heaven and new earth where only righteousness dwells. This is our hope. This is what we're looking forward to as we pray into these world events.